church about women. And then we looked at research pointing to ways that these things actually exacerbate violence against women, and discussed the role the church often plays in creating a world that is unsafe for women. So we specifically considered things you hear in church about Eve and the creation of women and women's role in the fall. We talked about women and leadership and about marriage. Each time then revisiting key passages of scripture. Today is almost like an interlude, if you will. Let's say a little breather. Before we tackle some of the most controversial issues next week. Today we shall consider Jesus and women. And as such, we are stepping out of the violent, abusive narratives and taking a more appreciative view. So, simply stated, I am not drawing such a clear connection between gender-based violence and the traditional church, teaching of the church today as I did in previous weeks. However, I will remind you of the foundational theory for the work we do here, which is still Rachel Jukes' seminal work on intimate partner violence. And the graph on the screen, reproduced by my colleague Marius Gertsen, summarizes Jukes' findings. So Jukes considers a constellation of factors causing gender-based violence. And in the end, she says these factors can be taken back to two underlying ideologies. And these are patriarchy and our culture of violence. And patriarchy and our culture of violence then work together to form this constellation, creating a society where GBV thrives. Sorry, Yoletta, I think your mic is still on, but I'm wondering, are you recording the meeting? I think you
No,
might.
my mic is off and the meeting is recording.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so somebody else's mic is still on. So, all right, just for clarity, when we talk about patriarchy, we're not talking about men. We're talking about a system that we are all part of, a system that privileges men above women. And when we talk about a culture of violence, we're not talking about one culture group in South Africa. We're talking about our country's collective social culture. All right, so the ideology is creating a fertile atmosphere for gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa, our patriarchy, and our culture of violence. And as I said in our first session, this is where the church comes in, as there have been numerous studies documenting the church's collusion with patriarchy, which then ends up, perhaps unintentionally, creating a fertile ground for gender-based violence and femicide. So what about Jesus? Well, Jesus was born and lived in a deeply patriarchal society. Musa Dube reminds us that in the time of Jesus, the Jews and the other nations of the Middle East, including some African countries, were under the colonial rule of the Roman Empire. Jesus himself was a Jew living within the culture, religion, and political institutions of Israel. Dube underlines that the Roman Empire, with its Greek cultural overtones, was structured along class and patriarchal lines, with power lying primarily in the hands of rich men. So the Roman Empire was organized from a patriarchal perspective and believed that families constituted the basic political unit, where the patriarch's leadership in the household ensured the political peace not only of the household but of the Roman Empire itself, which would then be violated if slaves, women, and children were not kept under control. So the patriarchy in the house was part of the political patriarchy and the colonial rule of the Roman Empire. Plus, while Jesus lived under this rule of the very patriarchal Roman Empire, the Israel of Jesus' day and its culture was also deeply patriarchal. Wives were sometimes even listed together with their husband's property, and women were associated with uncleanness or impurity. And this was the world that Jesus was born into. Jesus came and lived in a very patriarchal world, even more patriarchal than the world that we live in today. And the question then becomes, did Jesus conform to the patriarchy of his day? And as I've mentioned before, Mark is the oldest gospel in the Bible. And in the Gospel of Mark, we meet the following women. We meet Peter's mother-in-law, who serves Jesus, Mary seeking Jesus, the bleeding woman and the dead girl, Herodias and her dancing daughter, the Syrophoenician woman with a sick daughter, the widow who gave the greatest offering, the woman who anointed Jesus, the maid of the high priest, and then the women at the cross and the resurrection scene. And what we note here is that women were busy with their traditional roles in their patriarchal society. Yet within this patriarchal structure, Jesus empowers them, empowers women by breaking with tradition. So Jesus touches the quote-unquote unclean, bleeding woman and dead girl, restoring them to life in society. Jesus set the standard for discipleship through singling out a widow's gift in Mark 12. He allowed himself to be anointed by a woman, Mark 14, and declared that wherever the gospel is preached, the name of this woman should be proclaimed for what she did. And this command has, of course, largely been neglected. Furthermore, Jesus' disciples and followers included women. For the writer of Mark tells us at the very end of the gospel that, quote, there were also women. These women used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem, Mark 15, meaning that these women were Jesus' disciples as well as the financial backing for his ministry. And then it is significant that the resurrection was witnessed by women who were sent to go and tell the good news. All of this is countercultural to the patriarchal world of Jesus' time. And now we know that Mark is the shortest gospel, of the oldest gospel, but it is also the shortest gospel. So the other gospels elaborate on Jesus' attitude towards women, and John's gospel in particular elaborately depicts Jesus' attitude towards women. The passages in John's gospel that show Jesus with women are where Mary prompts Jesus to provide wine, the Samaritan woman who goes preaching, the woman caught in adultery, Jesus weeps for the tears of Mary, Martha, Mary, and Judas, the women faithful to the end, and then John 20, Mary Magdalene obeys the instruction to go and spread the word. And I want to pause today with two of these women. And the first one is the beautiful story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4. And here we find the longest recorded conversation that Jesus had with anyone. And this is noteworthy in itself, but it is especially noteworthy in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is given to extensive monologues. So in John 4, Jesus left Judea and started back to Galilee, but he had to go through Samaria. Did he have to go through Samaria, though? Most Jews chose to travel around Samaria. So extreme was the animosity between the Jewish and the people of Samaria. Simply passing through Samaria was enough to make the Jews impure. Jesus had to go through Samaria not because it was the only route, but in order to gather the Samaritans to them. So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. So, okay, let's just put some background in place here. There was extreme animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans. They disagreed theologically. So, for example, they disagreed about where God should be worshipped. But they also had historical bad blood. When the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians, which we read about in the Old Testament, most Israelites were taken into exile. A few stayed behind, while the Assyrians then settled the land of Israel with people from 5 different nations. And then we read in 2 Kings 17, verse 24, the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Kuta, Apha, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria, in place of the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and settled in its cities. And each of these nations made idols and put these idols in the Israelite temples. And the implications then is that the Samaritans, being the few Israelites who stayed behind, allowed this. So the Samaritans are accused of idolatry because their religion became a mixture of the Jewish religion and that of the surrounding settling nations. But not only did they mix their Jewish religion, but also their Jewish race. They not only worshipped idols, but they married the settlers. So the Samaritans as a nation is the product of the intermarriage between the Jews that were left behind in the northern kingdom during the exile and the nations that settled the land. So according to Jewish law, they and their descendants were not allowed in the Jewish temple, not even to the 10th generation, which basically means no descendant ever. So, okay, let's go back to John 4, verse 6. Jacob's well was there. And now, if you hear the name Jacob's well, you should think boy meets girl at well. Because this is how Isaac met Rebekah, Jacob met Rachel, and Moses met Zipporah. So Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. So just for a moment, just take note of the time. Because we know there is a woman on her way to fetch water. Can you imagine a worse time of day to fetch water? Usually one would fetch water early in the morning or late afternoon, but not in the heat of the day. And then groups of women would go to fetch water together, affording them protection from being accosted by groups of men should they go alone to the remote well. These outings to gather water would also serve a social purpose, where the women would share stories and support one another. But here, at the heat of the day, a single solitary woman shows up, which would suggest that she is avoiding the other women. She is such an outcast that she rather takes a chance going to the remote area on her own to fetch water at the hottest time of the day, rather than facing the judgment of the other women. Verse 7, a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." Now again, this is absolutely shocking. First of all, the fact that Jesus, a man, talks to a woman in public, that is scandalous. And this is not just any woman, this is a Samaritan woman. She is the other, the excluded, the unclean in every possible way. And it seems that Jesus is even prepared to drink from her vessel, which would by definition have been ritually impure and then rendered Jesus impure. His disciples had gone to the city to buy food, and the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Jews did not share things in common with Samaritans. Now, this woman is what one would call feisty. And of course, she is suspicious. This is not the actions one would expect if you were a woman on your own, unexpectedly meeting a man, a strange man in a remote place. it would not be outside the realm of possibility for her to expect to be violently accosted. At the very least, if Jesus were a proper Jew, he would have kept his distance and ignored her. So this woman is ready for a fight. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." Now Jesus is engaging this woman in a theological conversation. He is honoring her enough, regarding her enough to pull her into a discussion. And this type of discussion would have in Jesus' world been kept exclusively for equals. So Jesus is treating her like he would have treated a male equal. And the woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." The woman answered, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." And it is right here that the telling of the story comes off the rails. Not the story itself, but the historical interpretations and retellings of it. Because how many times have you heard this woman referred to as loose or promiscuous? How many times has she been used as an example of a sinful woman? But let us consider her actions. Perhaps she was a widow. And this could have been one of those cases about the levirate marriage. If you remember the story of Tamar in Genesis 38. If a man dies without an heir, his brother must marry the woman in order to sire an heir for his older brother. If the next brother then dies without siring an heir, the next brother has to marry her, etc., etc. And we know from the story of Tamar that Jacob then refused to let his youngest son marry Tamar. This could have been the Samaritan woman situation. But even if it wasn't, the fact is that in Jesus' patriarchal society, a wife could not divorce her husband. There simply was no legal recourse or possibility for the female party to end a marriage. A husband, on the other hand, could divorce his wife for almost any reason, simply by repeating 3 times, "I divorce you." One rabbi wrote that a husband could divorce his wife if he did not find her attractive anymore or if she burnt the food. Just by saying 3 times, "I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you." And then, what is a divorced woman to do? In the patriarchal society of Jesus' day, she, being discarded by her husband, is dishonored and has dishonored her father. If she is lucky, her father will take her back, but most probably her father will not take her back. What would her options be then in this highly patriarchal society of her day? She could marry again if she was lucky, if someone was prepared to take this dishonored woman, or she could become a beggar, or she could become a sex worker. And say, for example, that she found a man who was willing to care for her, with certain conditions, of course, she had no right to demand that he marry her. There was no precedent, no expectation. All she had was the hope that he would not throw her out as well. Those were her options. And if you know this about her world, what does it then mean when Jesus said, "You are right in saying, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband"? Jesus is not rebuking her. Jesus is seeing her. He's acknowledging her. He's acknowledging the abuse that she has suffered, having been thrown away over and over again, having to do whatever is necessary to survive. Jesus is not exposing her shame. He is seeing her pain. Imagine if someone does that to you. If you are used to being discarded, to not mattering, and someone looks you in the eyes and says, I know what has been done to you. That is some beautiful healing going on there. Okay, but now this woman knows better than to simply trust anyone. She's experienced life. She's not yet prepared to let her guard down. So she continues a theological conversation with Jesus. And again, this is not something that one would expect in Jesus' time. This was not allowed. Women engaging men in public theological discourse is unheard of. And yet the woman said to him, Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know the Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us. Jesus said to her, I am he, the one who is speaking to you. I am he. And actually what is written in the Greek is ego eimi, which translates, I am. Jesus' words translated into Hebrew are exactly the same words that God used when he told Moses, I am. And this is the first time we hear these words in John. This is the first time that Jesus is revealed in this way. And they are spoken to the Samaritan woman. Just then the disciples came. They were astonished that he was speaking with a woman, but no one said, What do you want? Or why are you speaking with her? As men are wont to do when Jesus breaks the rules of the patriarchy. Or in the words of Sandra Schneiders, this verse reveals the all too familiar uneasiness of men when one of their number takes a woman too seriously, especially in the area of men's primary concern. Verse 28, then the woman left her water jar. And this is an intriguing little detail. Sorry, I see I'm at the wrong slide. Perhaps she simply forgot the jar in her excitement. But John does not tend to give unnecessary detail. The water jar being left behind is probably a signal to her changing role in life. The water jar is similar to the male disciples leaving their nets and boats behind to follow Jesus. And she went back to the city. She said to the people, Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he? They left the city and were on their way to him. And then we skip a couple of verses in verse 39. Many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I have done. So this woman delivers probably the shortest sermon in history and the most successful. After meeting Jesus, this woman goes from being a social outcast to a powerful preacher. The Samaritan woman embodies one of the primary marks of discipleship in John, bearing witness to Jesus. Musa Dube says the encounter with Jesus should continue to transform women's culturally gendered roles and empower them. If the gospel does not free women from their gendered roles today, then it is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. So the next woman that we will stop at with Jesus is the one we meet in John 8. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Now, there are several things wrong with this scene. Forget the fact that they don't care about the woman, but they're just using her as an object to get to Jesus. But the immediate question is, where is the man? I mean, one does not commit adultery on one's own. The law they're referring to is Leviticus 20. If a man commits adultery with a wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. And Deuteronomy 22, if a man is caught lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die. The man who lie with a woman as well as the woman. When the scribes and Pharisees say that the law commanded such a woman to be stoned, they are only quoting half the law, because according to the law, both parties should be put to death. And also the law does not talk about stoning. Furthermore, the law requires 2 eyewitnesses. These accusers bring none. They do say she was caught in the very act, but they do not provide the required witnesses. So there are several possibilities. There might not have been any eyewitnesses, or it could have been a trap. Because how do you catch someone in the act of committing adultery with 2 eyewitnesses if the man was not in on it? So this woman might have been the victim of a plot to entrap her. But there is another intriguing possibility. Perhaps you remember last year we read the story of Susanna. Now, Susanna's story is an apocryphal part of the Old Testament book of Daniel. And there we are told of 2 religious leaders who peeped while Susanna was taking a bath in her private locked garden. They tried to rape her, and when Susanna resisted, they accused her of adultery. And you will remember Susanna is given no opportunity to defend herself. Only the 2 obscene old men are allowed to speak in the court proceedings. And the story then points to Daniel's wisdom in proving the woman's innocence. Which could mean that this woman, who is being brought to Jesus, is being falsely accused. We don't know. We can't judge. And Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger in the ground. And this is the only place where we read that Jesus wrote. Some people say he wrote, "Where is the man?" Or something like, "It takes 2." Or that he listed the accuser's sins. Or the law. Or that he simply doodled. But the point is, what you should note here is that Jesus stepped out of the circle of violence. He physically removed himself from the violent patriarchy. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again, he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And for the first time, someone actually speaks to the woman. For the first time. Listens to her. Acknowledges her. Jesus. She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on do not sin again." Musa Dube again points to another gender stereotype in this story, and one she finds in contemporary culture as well, that we know well, namely that sexual sins on the part of women is condemned, but implicitly accepted on the part of men. But Dube points out that Jesus refuses to subscribe to this gender discriminative worldview. Jesus does not discriminate on the basis of gender. And in this story, Jesus shows that violence against women is unacceptable. And secondly, Jesus shows that the law should not be interpreted in such a way as to discriminate against women, but should rather be applied equally to men and women. And there are many examples of Jesus breaking gender stereotypes and empowering women. We could spend a whole year just on women's encounters with Jesus. Jesus encouraged women to study and to learn. He commissioned women to preach the gospel to the unbelieving world, the Samaritans, and to believers, the disciples. He touched women as friends. He helped women. He interpreted abuse laws in new ways in order to protect women. He gave women public roles and engaged with women on public platforms. Or, in the words of one of my favorite quotes of all times by Dorothy Sayers in 1938 already, in her address entitled "Are Women Human?" And she speaks about Jesus and says, "Perhaps it is no wonder that the women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man. There never has been such another. A prophet and a teacher who never nagged at them, never flattered or coaxed or patronized, who never made arch jokes about them, never treated them either as the women, God help us, or the ladies, God bless them, who rebuked without querulousness and praised without condescension, who took their questions and arguments seriously, who never mapped out their sphere for them, never urged them to be feminine or jeered at them for being female, who had no axe to grind and no uneasy male dignity to defend, who took them as he found them and was completely unself-conscious. There is no act, no sermon, no parable in the whole gospel that borrows its pungency from female perversity. Nobody could possibly guess from the words and deeds of Jesus that there was anything funny about woman's nature. Thank you. I think we have enough time to have a nice discussion, and maybe consider if you have ideas and questions of some of Jesus's other meetings with women. Thank you, Yoletta.
Thank you so much, Rev. Wow, that was very informative, a very informative session indeed. As always, the sessions are always thought-provoking. Does anybody have a question or a comment that they would like to make with regards to, oh, we have Hannah who says, which books would you recommend that speak more about Jesus and women?
Okay, I'm thinking now. So my readings tend to be more theological. I know Ethel is in the room. Ethel, do you have a suggestion of a easily accessible book about Jesus and women? And maybe while Ethel thinks, okay, Ethel, can you respond? You're still muted, Ethel.
Okay. Sorry, if you look behind me, you'll see there's a whole bookcase full of them. What I can do is there somewhere that I could perhaps put 4 or 5 books that I would recommend that are easy to read, and yeah, and where can I do that? And I can send a list.
I think maybe send it to me and then I will give it to you later, and then people who want can get it from you later. Thank you, Ethel.
I'll do that. Okay.
Ethel is an excellent resource. The one book that I have next to me, because it is one of my favorites, light is a little bit weird now, is called Back to the Well, Women's Encounters with Jesus in the Gospels. And this is by Frances Taylor Gensch. So this is more of a commentary. But what is nice about this is she's also got group study suggestions. I'm not sure if you can see. After every chapter, she's got group study suggestions. So if you want to read it in a small group, and she's got questions for discussions and reflections. And it has got 6 chapters of some of the gospel stories with Jesus meeting women. And I mean, these stories, I only choose 2 today. There's the story of Jesus with a Canaanite Syrophoenician woman, which is just, oh, it is such a beautiful woman. The story of the hemorrhaging, of the bleeding woman, the story of Mary and Martha, and then the bent woman. So Frances Taylor Gensch, I've actually written her fan mail, legit fan mail, because I fangirl over her. She's very good if you can access any of her resources, and because she's a professor in New Testament at Union Theological Seminary, you might even access some of her work through the university's library.
Yes. Can I show some titles?
Yes, please.
Can you see them?
Yes.
This is Liz Curtis Higgs. Her books are easily available, and they're called, some of the titles are Really Bad Girls of the Bible, Slightly Bad Girls of the Bible, and Bad Girls of the Bible. Many of those stories that you shared today. Wonderful resource, and also has parts to study. And then, of course, my all-time favorite is Jesus Feminist by Sarah Bessey. Also another one, but I'll send you a long list.
Thank you, Ethel. Adelaide, you had a hand raised.
Thank you so much for today's session. I am truly learning a lot, and I'm very grateful that I've been able to follow this series. I'm just wanting to ask, with Jesus' teachings and how he interacted with women, which was basically showing an example to not only his disciples but to everyone in that time, what the role of women is in the church. And as you said, he urged them to actually actively participate in ministry and so forth. So my question is then, despite Jesus's teachings and his interactions, why is it that there are very few accounts written by women in the Bible that we have right now. I remember in last week's session, you spoke about how there's good evidence to show that Priscilla probably wrote Hebrews, but it's that thing where we have so few that we can draw reference from. So already the perspective of the Bible, because surely if we had heard the perspective of the woman from the well, really knowing, as you said now, some aspects of the history as to what may have really happened and why that conversation at the well was so significant for her and in changing her life. I think as women would have been able to identify more with that scripture because it would be directly speaking to us. So I don't know, that's just then, it's just that question of, even though Jesus put this out there and they were obviously active disciples at that point, could they not have written their own accounts? That then brings me to the questions that are there, that they are lost gospels and so forth that were probably written by women. So that's just my question there. Thank you.
You're muted.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Adelaide. I said that's a beautiful and a moving question. I want to answer you on 3 levels. I think that the first is that what we must remember is this was an extremely patriarchal society. So while the things that Jesus did was countercultural, the world was still patriarchal. So these women, like even today, where I will say I live in a patriarchal society, I'm allowed to speak, I have a voice, but it is still a struggle. This would have been much worse for these women. So if we just think of what that world looked like, the fact that these things happened is radical. And we should probably amplify that to say, if it was so radical in that world, it means more in our world, in terms of the equality of women. But that also means that women did not, even if Jesus gave women a voice, that does not mean that society gave women a voice. Society crucified Jesus. So the world was still patriarchal. And then as such, in a patriarchal world, most women would not have been educated. So we know, for example, Priscilla was educated, but we also know the early church had many poor people, many slaves, many women. So women would not have necessarily been writers. They would not have, even if you do a study in South Africa, in the written history of South Africa, you will find less things written about women or by women in the early history of written history in South Africa. And when you do find things written by women, it will be house shopping lists and things like that. So simply the fact that women did not have access to education, to having, also you have a society where they did not have books yet. So they still had scrolls. The Christians were the first who started writing letters. So the women would not have necessarily had access to that. And then just one example would be Mary Magdalene. I don't know who of you have ever heard the story that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. There's a popular culture idea that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. There is no basis for that. Not in the Bible, not in the historical writings, nothing. What we know is that she was one of Jesus's disciples. We know that she was the one that was first commissioned by Jesus to proclaim the resurrection, that she was the first one to proclaim the resurrection. We also know from extra biblical historical sources that after Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples, the male disciples, were very confused, sort of like a chicken without a head. They didn't know, they were running around. And that Mary Magdalene started telling them, but you remember Jesus said that. You remember this is what he told us this was going to happen. And that one of the first Christian communities started around Mary Magdalene and around her leadership. So there is a gospel called the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which was lost to us. There is only a little tiny sliver of it left. It was destroyed. Mary Magdalene historically is referred to as the Apostle of the Apostles. Around the time that the Gospel of Mary Magdalene disappeared, the story started that she was a prostitute. And this would have been several centuries after Jesus' crucifixion. So it seems that there was a campaign to smear Mary Magdalene and to remove her name and her legacy from the story of Christianity. So that is the sort of historical, the facts. But if I can put another more personal and faith lens over that, I've often in my life struggled with God being a woman called to ministry. And I've told God many times, you know, you would have made my life much easier if I were born a man. If you know, those texts that say, God created you in the womb, God called you before you were born. If God knew he was going to call me to ministry, he could have created me as a man. Things would have been much easier for all of us. But I believe in my struggle with this, that God chose to create me as a woman and call me to ministry because there are certain aspects that I understand about vulnerability, about people being excluded, that I would not have understood had I been born a man. So the disappearance of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the story of Mary Magdalene being a prostitute is probably political, yes. I see we have 5 minutes left. I don't know if there's one quick question that someone still wants to ask, or I'll hand over to you, Yoletta.
I have a question in terms of, it seems like I want to know, it seems like the whole thing of men being superior over women has been driven so much. It's like they've gone to even extreme lengths to perpetuate that whole narrative. What is the origin? What is the basis of the people from those times to think that women were inferior? Because even in the Bible, even Genesis, I don't recall there being something that said women were inferior, but seemingly there's a lot that has been driving this narrative since that time. I hope the question makes sense.
Yeah. Short answer, I don't know. Another short answer, sin. Why are people racist? Why are people homophobic? Why do people make war? And humanity has done this from the very beginning. So it feels like a bit of a cop-out answer, but I'm going to stick with sin. I see there's another hand. Is it Mpho?
Good afternoon, ma'am. I just wanted to ask in terms of Mary Magdalene not being a prostitute. That was like also something that I learned today. And I wanted to ask, for curiosity's sake or for correction's sake, who was the woman that washed Jesus's feet with her hair?
Thank you, Mpho. So there are different stories of women washing Jesus's feet, and it's not necessarily the same woman. We do have the story of the woman washing Jesus's feet with her hair, and the Bible simply says that she was a sinful woman, so she's not named. We also know that Mary of Bethany, Martha's sister, washed Jesus's hair with expensive perfume. But let's go back to the sinful woman. So the sinful woman is not identified as Mary Magdalene. She's simply identified as a sinful woman. Why does that make her a prostitute or a sex worker? So it seems that in patriarchy's imagination, female sin has to be sexual. She could have been a thief. She could have been a murderer. She could have been a gossip. And Jesus forgave her of her sin, and because she was forgiven and she understood what that meant, that is why she washed Jesus's hair, washed Jesus's feet. Bible simply identifies her as sinful, not as a prostitute or a sex worker. Although we can talk a long time about the fact that she washed Jesus's feet with her hair, which is a very intimate act, and the fact that Jesus allowed that is also one of those countercultural things. Yoletta, I'm
Thank you,
handing
ma'am.
over to you.
Okay, so Mpho, you sorted. Are you happy with your answer?
Yes, yes, I am.
Okay, any more questions? We'll take one more question and then we are done. If there's no question, then we can just go into the notices. Any more questions? Okay, it's seemingly that there are no further questions. Again, thank you so much, Rev. As always, your sessions, like I said, are always so informative and thought-provoking. And I must say my biggest takeaway from the whole session today is that Jesus didn't say much about the value of women verbally, but he demonstrated, he preached with his actions of how valuable women are in society. That was my biggest takeaway. And thank you so much once again for that. Before we wrap it up, I just have a few notices. In terms, you can check out the Transformation Office website for more details and information about what the office does. And also there's Nelson Mandela Transformation Office Facebook page. Please follow, like, and share. Also check out the Mandela Transformation YouTube channel, like, subscribe, and further share, as well as follow the Amanda Memeza Facebook page. There are self-defense classes every Tuesday and Thursday from 4 to 5 on campus. And also just to know the dates, just check out memo on what's happening if you're a student and the staff of Nelson Mandela University as well. And there is a first responders course guide on Moodle. It's for free for both staff and students. It just gives you, it equips you in terms of how to handle support people that are around you who've experienced trauma without further causing damage. There are also queer, female, and male support groups as well, and groups for perpetrators called Singamadoda. And then there are weekly events at 12 until 1. There's an event on queer support and queer events on Tuesdays, and then on Wednesdays, as well as there is equality promotion and social inclusion on Thursdays. Yeah, that's it on what's happening at the Transformation Office. Again, thank you everyone for attending this session. I look forward to seeing everybody again next week on Wednesday, same time, and yes, in the same platform. Everyone have a lovely afternoon further.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rev. Bye.